Costa and I had put an application into TV New Zealand, who were asking for submissions for contemporary dramas for a television series they were making, and so we had this concept for what was essentially a period documentary that we thought we may as well put in for a laugh, because we liked the idea and we didn't really know what forum it would be suitable for. It wasn't a feature film, and it wasn't a sort of a short 10-minute movie. It had to be longer than that, and this television New Zealand series was for 60-minute episodes, and so we thought that Forgotten Silver would actually fit very well into that, except it wasn't a contemporary drama. It was a period documentary.
The trick with this documentary, of course, was that it wasn't going to be true. It was going to be a little white lie from beginning to end.
Flicked on the radio and there was talkback, and the first thing that we heard were all these people raving and ranting about this brilliant Colin Mackenzie and how absolutely sensational he is, and why has he not been heard of, and he's one of the greatest Kiwis that have ever lived.
There was this documentary going by that was plausible, and it connected to a whole lot of film history, quite vague but definite, if that makes sense. Stuff that I knew and that it could have been possible. And after a short while, I think I figured that it was not a small lie, a great big lie.
Forgotten Silver was, in some respects, it was a lot of improvisation. Costa and I had worked on a screenplay which had the structure and it had a degree of the narration, and we certainly knew what we wanted. But when you're obviously interviewing people and you don't know what their answers are, the interviews that I did with Sam Neill and with Leonard Maltin and Harvey Weinstein, I knew the direction that we wanted to go, but obviously they were giving me answers in their own words. It wasn't like a script had been written for them.
I've got to confess, Colin Mackenzie was just a name I'd read somewhere in a book, in a history book, and he didn't have...
Around about that time, I took a trip to LA. I took the opportunity of that trip to get a little film crew together in Los Angeles and interview a couple of people that we thought would be useful to have on the show.
This New Zealand filmmaker is going to rank, with the greats like D.W. Griffith, and I think in some ways infinitely better.
I first heard of Colin Mackenzie at the Film Minute when I worked there, and there was an old chap there called Stan Wilson.
When you see somebody who you recognise, who is an authority on a particular subject, in this case film, talking with authority and with conviction about Colin Mackenzie, I think it became very difficult for people to believe that this couldn't possibly be true.
Because we chose a filmmaker as a subject, it gave us almost a license to have a lot of fun, to reproduce the look of old movies. And for Peter, I know his great enthusiasm for it was to get into silent comedies and to get into the trenches of Gallipoli in World War One, the battlefields of Spain. It was a fantastic opportunity to actually create a whole range of different film looks and play around with things in a way that wouldn't be necessarily all that difficult.
In terms of shooting it, I was always very much aware of the techniques of the silent filmmakers, and I wanted to use similar lenses, similar framing to what they did. And if you look at old films from pre-1910, they're often framed incredibly badly, where they're pointing the camera at somebody, but they've got it too high and too far to the left, and somebody's head is just down the bottom of the frame. So we duplicated that, for instance. I remember on one of the shots of Richard Pearce, we sort of tilted the camera far too high. The
entire sequence you see of the flight of Richard Pearce is, to the best of our ability, an exact representation of what everyone believes actually happened. Witnesses describe Richard Pearce flying several hundred metres and then veering off and crashing into a hedge. But none of the witnesses can actually agree on the precise date, and there's no verifiable proof. What we chose to do was place Pearce at the earlier date so that he would beat the Wright brothers into the air. Whereas the Wright brothers were undeniably the first people to get into the air, steer the aeroplane and land again safely, and I guess that's what flight is all about.
We've always seen faked old silent movies or black and white films, and it's always seemed very crude to me where something's black and white, they put some scratches down it, they kind of speed the camera up, and that's as far as they go. And so I wanted to do something that was a little better than that.
We dragged the film round on the floor, trying to get as much dirt in it as possible, but unfortunately the laboratory being rather a sort of clean place, we didn't quite achieve that. So the next step was to take it down into the basement and to drag it round down there, and I had a couple of interesting sort of spots where leaky pipes were dripping onto the ground, and those sort of spots were great stuff for picking up all sorts of dirt. With some of the stuff we had to put a lot of scratching on, stuff that was obviously off early prints which had been projected and run through all sorts of equipment. Had a lot more scratching than other material which wasn't, well, it had never been seen. There was stuff in the Spanish archives of the Spanish Civil War which had never been seen much at all, so that didn't have too much in the way of scratching at all.
Peter was directing a lot of the motion picture activity while we were shooting stills, quite often on the same set at the other end of the set. So there was always going to be conflicts with trying to pull actors out from shooting in front of the main camera to come and have stills taken.
It didn't seem that difficult a notion to go out and photograph a whole lot of actors dressed up in different costumes and pretending to be doing different things. After all, you know, one stills camera and a few actors, how difficult could that be? Well, in the finish it was extremely difficult because of the number of performers needed, the range of makeups and the range of wardrobe, and trying to coordinate all that with the ongoing filming of Colin's films.
A lot of it, quite a majority of it, is actually nice, beautiful photos taken by Chris Code. Of course, there was a shooting schedule where Peter Jackson had to film all the action sequences, and Costa and Chris, they had to somehow stop the whole thing to say, hey, look, we actually need some photos here because, you know, we need to prove and show the backstory of this guy through stills.
We were shooting over 20 rolls of 35mm a day, and I think it took about 4 months printing in the darkroom. So it just grew and grew and grew. It was certainly, I think, the single biggest darkroom project that I've ever been involved in. On several occasions, we had a prop megaphone that we used for stills. We had to delay still shooting from time to time because the director was using it on the main set.
The development of the music for the film was an extended process. I was contacted really early in editing by a group of people calling themselves collectively Plan 9. That's Janet Roddick, David Donaldson and Steve Roche. And they gave me their pitch and asked me to consider them for any projects that I might be developing.
When we first watched it and started working on it, it was obviously that you had to kind of distill a feeling for a period in a sort of a generic way so that people would know what part of the century you were talking about or what location you were talking about. So the music that we did, we had to try and achieve the essence of that idea, really.
The music is the drama, and that's why they need so much music. It's boring just to have photo stills and show heaps of them. You actually have got to be telling the story musically as well.
After the first screening of Forgotten Silver on New Zealand television in October 1995, the reaction was distinctly mixed, and I guess there was a feeling of overwhelming surprise in my mind to the degree to which we had succeeded in fooling people, and also the degree of strong emotion from people who hated the thought that they had been fooled.
I'm astonished that you would screen this on TV. Can do nothing but harm, a real negative impact. I am so angry. I'll never watch another documentary again without thinking, is this serious? For heaven's sake, you even did an article on this bloke in The Listener. Are you all children?
I feel cheated. TVNZ has not made any friends for themselves screening this.
Montana Sunday theatre is usually good, but this was brilliant. I'm going to be sure not to miss it in the future.
Well, What wankers you turned out to be. You're playing with people's pride, man.
It wasn't a have, was it? Oh, it was. Yes, I thought so. It was too contrived. The film quality was too good. I felt sure that something would have come to light sooner if it had been fact.
I think it is bloody disgusting that TVNZ could show this appalling deceptive program. I want to come around and put a brick through your window.
Although we were presenting Forgotten Silver as a piece of documentary truth, and the listener article that Dennis Welsh did for us, or did with us, just before it came out, helped enormously to present this as being true right up until the very moment that it screened and during the screening. I guess I felt somehow that the fact that it was fake would get out, or people would discover this before the screening, and so the screening would actually happen with everybody's awareness that it wasn't true. But as it turned out, the secret was very well kept, and we did ask everybody who worked on the show not to say anything.
On the day of watching Forgotten Silver, I travelled home to a place called Napier to stay with my parents on a Sunday night, and we all sat down to watch it. And we got a friend over from next door, and she had no idea at all that it was a big hoax. And so we sat down, and I remember looking out of the corner of my eye and seeing her leaning forward when we had the Richard Pearce flight footage, and they'd said it was the first they'd ever seen. You know, this was history-making stuff, and I remember her leaning forward and just looking at it and just going, oh, that's extraordinary. She was absolutely blown away by it, despite actually seeing this guy on screen who was me.
I knew it had been publicly funded, and I thought this is going to make some people upset, but I didn't really have any indication of how much of an impact it would have until after it was shown for the first time.
The potential for the audience to come after the makers with guns was always there. They potentially could feel really had. And I figured that if you could ease them, if you could somehow overcome the fact of that they hadn't felt done, cheated, that they'd been given a giggle on the way, that perhaps we'd be all right.
For 24, 48 hours after the screening on TV, this new national hero had been discovered. I know that the Museum of New Zealand were talking about wanting to devote some space in their exhibit hall for Colin Mackenzie artefacts. They contacted us to talk about acquiring some of his old cameras and some of the things that we clearly had possession of. That film tutors were talking to their students about it the following day, claiming that they knew all about Colin Mackenzie, and that they made themselves look incredibly stupid, of course, when the truth came out a little bit later.
Terribly disappointed old lady watched Sunday theatre last night and went to bed so happy. She woke up this morning and all her friends told her the Forgotten Silver was just a hoax. Why did you do that, TVNZ?
I'm totally confused. What's the crux of the hoax? You know, Forgotten Silver? Can't quite work it out.
I've always felt that the best place to hide a lie is right behind the truth, and there's a lot of truth in Forgotten Silver. Even though the story being told is fictional, we're constantly interweaving our fiction with real historical fact.
The onset of the Great War led to a huge outpouring of patriotic sentiment in the colonies of the British Empire.
We engaged the researcher during the writing of Forgotten Silver. Our researcher was Nick Booth, whose father, the late Jim Booth, was a great supporter of this project, and it was very inspirational and encouraging to me in particular at a time when I had begun to feel that there was no way that Forgotten Silver would ever be made. And so it was very apt that Nick was able to come in and help us when we were actually getting onto it. You can see Nick here playing one of the skinny, emaciated wretches in Herod's dungeon.
It was a very hands-on experience. There was a lot of friends, a lot of people in the crew who actually appeared on screen. I know that Charlie McKillen, who's our digital effects supervisor, who worked on The Frighteners and is now in charge of the Lord of the Rings digital effects. Is actually he's manning a machine gun in the Gallipoli scene. That's him firing the Maxim machine gun in the trenches. And we just got a lot of friends who were hanging around and put them in the movie. It was very low budget, and it was made with a spirit of low budget filmmaking that I don't get to do very often these days. And so, for that reason, it was an enormous amount of fun to be involved in.
One of the most enjoyable aspects of working on the production was working with John Girdlestone, the production designer, who would create believable sets for stills within minutes. Wherever you pointed a camera, it just looked right. I didn't have to do very much work at all. Everything was done. In fact, John actually appeared in one of the stills as a Palermo brother.
As a fresh assault begins, a soldier falls directly in front of Colin. Colin puts the camera down. He runs to help. He stumbles. Both men are killed.
I remember on the day that we were shooting that, all these extras with explosions and things, I was running along behind the charging army with my little camera, filming, and I tripped over and tore a great hole in my knee, which caused me to limp. And I immediately, because I was about 2 weeks away from having to start to shoot the Frighteners, and my first thought was I'd broken some bone, and that film was going to have to get postponed.
I'll always remember running out, picking up this guy, used to these things exploding around me, all this dust coming up, and then falling down and just seeing this dust settle, and Peter just popping his head up from the corner, from behind the camera, just going, "Yeah, that looks great."
Stan the Man sequence is inspired by real filmmakers in New Zealand history. People like Riddle Hayward, who would go from town to town just in the way that we presented, and they would shoot their movies with a lot of local people as performers. During the week they'd make the movie, and in the weekend, as quick as that, they'd screen it. And people would come from far and wide to see themselves on screen, which is a terrific sort of community thing. They were called community comedies, and it seemed like a good opportunity for us to actually pay a little homage to these people, these real pioneers, within the context of our fiction.
At first, the idea of throwing pies at people and shoving people in, especially as it happened to be a friend of mine and his girlfriend into a pond in freezing cold weather, I found that rather difficult. But I have to say that it was kind of, it was almost insidious, but it was catching. After a while, I really began to enjoy myself.
One of the really amusing memories I have of the shooting of Forgotten Silver was the filming that we did on the steps of the National Museum and National War Memorial in the middle of the city, right next to a busy road. We decided this would be a good site for some of the Salome backgrounds, and also for some of the backgrounds of the scenes of us finding the lost city. So it must have been incredibly confusing for the drivers who came up the road that morning and looked up onto the steps of this memorial and saw it absolutely covered with jungle. We had trucked in trees, we had trucked in camouflage nets and leaves and dirt, and absolutely covered the place with jungle. And there we were, all clamouring around, pretending to be in the middle of the wildest jungle of the west coast of New Zealand.
You bring the shovels, Johnny! There's some concrete down underneath here. Look,
when you see Peter Jackson on his hands and knees digging deep into the mud and finding stone steps, he's actually finding real stone steps that actually exist right next to a very busy road in the middle of Wellington.
We needed one very important crowd scene, which was the premiere of Salome, the climax of the documentary, and really Colin's vindication. It was a very important scene, and we wanted to feature the premiere, we wanted the big cinema, the massive auditorium, and we wanted shots of the audience coming in and then applauding and cheering and giving Colin's movie a standing ovation. And there was no way we could afford to fill a cinema full of black tie audience for that shot. But we were very lucky in our timing, because the Wellington Film Festival was about to open, and Bill Gosden, the director of the festival, very kindly allowed us to hijack his opening night by setting up a camera and a tripod at the front of the cinema. And when Bill had given his opening speech before the film festival movie began, he let us have 10 minutes with the audience, and we filmed the audience giving us some rousing applause and standing ovation and stomping and cheering. And they actually were all acting for our camera, which was at the front of the auditorium. And Bill didn't want us to spend too much time doing it, because it was basically interfering with the opening night. And so we did it in probably in 5 or 6 minutes. We quickly had everybody jumping up and applauding, and then we whisked our camera away, ran down the stairs, and they started the film festival.